A word in the dark. The fading hues of a summer dusk spilled across Ridgeway Street, a narrow artery weaving through the heart of Pembroke, a forgotten southern town where time itself seemed to exhale slowly. Officer Danny Corbin sat in his patrol car, parked beneath the wide oak tree on the corner of Morrow and Ridgeway. The leaves cast fractured shadows across his windshield, patterns that danced whenever the evening breeze stirred the branches. The air smelled faintly of fried food, cut grass, and rain hanging somewhere just beyond the horizon. The radio murmured static-laced updates, but Danny only half listened. His fingers tapped lazily on the steering wheel, his mind wandering between thoughts of an upcoming custody hearing for his own son and the heavy weight of another day patrolling a town where trust between the badge and the people had long since eroded. A worn flyer fluttered on the passenger seat beside him. Another community meeting scheduled for the church hall, another chance for residents to air grievances that had no easy fixes. Accusations, frustrations, and fear had become common themes. To most, Officer Corbin wasn't just a cop. He was a symbol of the system they distrusted. A white officer in a predominantly black community, his uniform carried the history of every injustice the town had suffered. No amount of patient listening or sincere outreach seemed to erase the barrier between him and them. The crackle of the radio was interrupted by the sound of his own breath catching. On the curb just a block ahead, two small figures sat huddled together, their outlines barely distinguishable against the encroaching night. From this distance, they might have been a pair of stray dogs, thin, unmoving, wary. But as Danny eased the car forward, headlights slicing through the gathering dark, the figures solidified into two children, twins. They sat with knees drawn to their chests, arms locked around each other like a lifeline. Their clothes were torn, dirt smeared across bare knees and along the fabric like they'd been running or crawling. Faces streaked with something, either sweat, tears, or both. Even from the car, Danny could feel it. Fear. The kind that wasn't just discomfort or a bad dream. This was fear with roots, fear that made the air heavy. He pulled over slowly, making sure his tires crunched loud enough to announce his arrival. As he stepped out, boots scuffing against gravel and debris, he deliberately kept his hands away from his belt. No clipboard, no flashlight in their faces, just him and the quiet voice he used for his own son when nightmares woke the boy screaming. "Evening," he said softly. "Y'all all right?" The twins didn't move, not at first. Danny could see now. They were black, somewhere between 8 and 10 years old, their faces mirror images of each other, except for one thin scar tracing along the boy's chin. They were too still, too practiced at becoming invisible. He knelt down a few feet away, one knee pressing into the warm concrete. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, voice low. "I just want to make sure you're safe." The girl, older by seconds, perhaps judging by the slight authority in her posture, shifted just enough to place herself slightly in front of her brother. Her chin jutted forward, defiant even through the tremble in her hands. "Where's home?" Danny asked. "Can I take you there?" The girl's lips parted, a flicker of hesitation in her wide eyes. Her fingers curled into the hem of her brother's sleeve, and then, with a voice so quiet it might have been mistaken for a whisper of wind, she said it. "Help." It was just one word, but it was heavy. It was the kind of word that filled the gaps between bones, slipped under skin, and made a man's stomach clench with something darker than fear. Danny didn't ask her to repeat it. He didn't need to. "Okay," he said, standing slowly, making sure not to startle them. "Okay." He tapped his shoulder mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 14. I'm escorting 2 minors off Ridgeway. Possible welfare check. Stand by." The girl flinched at the squawk of the radio, her fingers tightening on her brother's arm. Danny lowered the volume, hating how even the sound of his tools could bring fear. "It's just so someone knows where we're going," he assured her. She gave the barest of nods. "Can you tell me your names?" The boy swallowed hard. "Corey," he said. "She's Kiana." "Nice to meet you both," Danny said, gentle. "Let's get somewhere safe, all right." The twins didn't argue. They stood slowly, moving like they expected sudden pain, and climbed into the back of the patrol car without a word. No protests. No questions. Just that oppressive silence that told Danny everything he needed to know. Whatever they were running from was still out there. The drive was quiet at first, the only sounds the occasional flick of the turn signal and the whisper of wind through cracked windows. Danny glanced at the rearview mirror often, watching the twins sit rigidly in the back seat. Kiana's arm was braced protectively across Corey's chest, her eyes locked on the road ahead, like she was watching for something or someone. "You guys like music?" Danny asked. "I've got a little of everything." No response. "Okay," he said, reaching for the dial. Soft jazz filled the car. A gentle melody with no sharp edges, the kind of sound that made it feel safe to breathe. "Where do you live?" Danny asked after a while, keeping his tone light. "I can drive you home if you want." Corey's eyes darted toward his sister, waiting for her to speak first. "We can't go back," Kiana said finally. "Why not?" She shook her head sharply. "We just can't." "Okay," Danny said again. He pulled the car into the station parking lot, leaving the engine running. "You don't have to tell me everything right now. Let's just get you inside where it's warm." But Kiana wasn't moving. Her fingers dug into her brother's hand, her breathing fast and uneven. Danny turned around fully, resting one arm on the back of his seat. "No one's gonna hurt you here," he promised. "We'll figure this out together." Finally, the door creaked open. Corey slid out first, Kiana right behind him, always between her brother and the world. Inside the station, the bright lights made the children blink rapidly. Danny led them past the front desk, past the curious glances from other officers, into the break room. He grabbed 2 bottles of water, setting them on the table before pulling out a chair. "Sit, if you want. No pressure." They sat, knees knocking together under the table. The girl's fingers tapped anxiously against the bottle, while Corey stared at the tile floor. "Want to tell me what happened?" Danny asked softly. Shadows beneath the porch. The low hum of the fluorescent lights in Pennybrook Police Station mixed with the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, a dull background noise that somehow made the silence between Kiana and Corey even heavier. Officer Danny Corbin stood just outside the break room door, leaning against the worn frame, his fingers absently spinning his wedding ring, a nervous habit he thought he'd broken years ago. But some nights, old anxieties came back like uninvited ghosts. Through the cracked door, he watched the twins huddle at the table. Kiana's thin shoulders were drawn so tight they almost touched her ears. Corey's small hands curled protectively around the plastic water bottle, crinkling it until the soft crackling filled the room like crumpled paper. They hadn't said much since they whispered about their stepmother. But Danny knew silence like this. It wasn't emptiness. It was survival. He stepped inside, pulling out the chair across from them with a soft scrape, lowering himself down slowly to avoid startling them. He set his forearms on the table, hands folded, open, not threatening, patient. "You did good coming to me," he said softly. "I know it wasn't easy." Neither twin spoke. Kiana's gaze stayed locked on the door, every muscle in her body braced for it to swing open. She wasn't listening for footsteps. She was listening for his footsteps, the weight and rhythm only children living in fear could recognize in the dark. "Can you tell me his name?" Danny asked. The silence stretched so long that Danny almost gave up. But then, Corey's voice, small, hoarse, broke through. "Royce." The word hung between them, as heavy as the heat pressing against the station's thin windows. "Royce what?" Kiana's head snapped up, her eyes wide with warning, but Corey's voice had found its edge. "Royce Mallard." The name stirred something in the back of Danny's mind. An old case, maybe, or a name that had floated through briefings over the years, but it didn't immediately click. "Is he home right now?" Danny asked, keeping his voice low. Kiana's lips pressed together so tight they turned pale. "He's always home," she said finally, her voice so soft it barely existed. "Even when he's not." The words sent a chill down Danny's spine. Kids didn't talk like that unless they'd been haunted. Not by ghosts, but by men who liked to leave reminders behind. Cracked doors, dented walls. The memory of footsteps pacing the hallway after the lights went out. Danny stood slowly. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe," he said, voice calm. "You're not going back there tonight." That should have been comforting. But instead, Kiana flinched like he'd slapped her. "You can't," she said sharply. "He knows." "Knows what?" "If we leave." Her hands balled into fists on the table, knuckles white with the force of her grip. "He always knows." Danny's skin prickled. "You mean he tracks you?" She shook her head. "No, it's not like that. He just knows, like the house tells him." The words made no sense, but Danny had worked enough years to understand one thing. To these kids, the house wasn't just wood and nails. It was alive. And it belonged to Royce. The night outside was deepening by the time Danny loaded the twins into the back seat of his patrol car. The warm air had cooled into a sticky southern fog, clinging to the windows and swallowing the edges of the streetlights. Ridgeway Street felt even quieter now, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. "Where are we going?" Corey asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The station's not safe," Danny admitted. "Too many eyes. I'm taking you somewhere no one will find you." Kiana's head snapped up. "Where?" "My place." The twins exchanged a glance, and for the first time, there was something in Kiana's eyes other than fear, doubt. "You don't know him like we do," she said quietly. "You don't know what he'll do." Danny caught her gaze in the rearview mirror. "You're not the first kid I've helped get away from someone like Royce," he said. "But you're right. I don't know him like you do. That's why you have to trust me, just a little, so I can figure out how to stop him." Kiana said nothing. But she didn't argue, either. Danny's house sat at the edge of Pinebrook, just past the last gas station, and the skeletal remains of an old rail yard. It was a modest place, a 2-bedroom ranch with peeling paint and a porch swing that hadn't swung in years, the kind of house where the silence felt too loud when you lived alone. He parked in the gravel driveway, cutting the engine. The crunch of the kid's shoes on the gravel seemed almost deafening in the stillness. Kiana's hand stayed locked around Corey's wrist as they followed him inside, every step hesitant, every doorway suspicious. They were measuring exits, memorizing the floor plan, mapping escape routes. They didn't trust houses. Not anymore. Danny led them to the living room, flipping on the soft lamp by the couch. The warm light softened the edges of the old furniture, the worn carpet, the framed photos of Danny's own son, Caleb, now a teenager living 2 counties over with his mother. "Bathroom's down the hall," Danny said. "There's some snacks in the kitchen if you're hungry." The twins stood near the door, not moving, not sitting, just watching. "I'll sleep on the couch," Danny said, hoping to ease their fear. "You can have the spare room." Kiana's arms stayed tight around her middle. "He's gonna come," she said quietly. Danny took a slow breath. "If he does, I'll handle him." "You don't understand," Kiana said, her voice brittle. "The house always calls him back, even when we try to leave." The way she said it made Danny's stomach tighten. "The house." Kiana swallowed hard. "Our house. It's his. Legally?" She shook her head. "No, like it's his." Her meaning settled cold and low in Danny's gut. In some places, houses belong to families. In others, houses belong to stories. And sometimes, those stories got so tangled with blood and fear they couldn't let go. "Nothing's going to happen tonight," Danny said firmly. "I promise." Kiana didn't look convinced, but she sat, just for a moment, on the edge of the couch, her fingers still curled into Corey's sleeve. The first sound came at 2:17 a.m. It was the front porch creaking. the slow, deliberate groan of weight shifting against old wood. Danny woke instantly, the habit of a man who'd spent too many years expecting bad things after dark. His hand found his gun beneath the pillow before his feet touched the floor. The twins were awake too. Kiana was at the bedroom door, her fingers white-knuckled against the frame, her wide eyes fixed on the front window. Corey sat cross-legged on the bed, knees pulled to his chest, rocking slightly, whispering something over and over that Danny couldn't hear. The porch creaked again. Slow, deliberate. Danny eased toward the front door, his pulse loud in his ears. Through the narrow window beside the door, he saw nothing, just fog curling around the posts, the empty street beyond. But the porch kept creaking, like someone shifting their weight, just out of sight. Danny opened the door fast, gun raised, flashlight cutting into the night. Nothing. Just empty air and the deep, heavy silence. But at the base of the porch steps, something lay half-buried in the gravel. A fragment of wood, old and splintered, the edges darkened with what might have been dirt, or something else. Carved into it, barely legible, was a single word. Home. Behind him, Kiana's voice trembled. He's here. The house remembers. The brittle fragment of wood rested in Danny's palm, the edges worn smooth by time, but the carved word, home, still raw enough to catch a sliver of moonlight through the fog. It felt warm in his hand, too warm for something left outside, and the moment his fingers brushed against it, a shiver lanced down his spine, deep into his bones. Kiana stood just inside the doorway, barefoot, her thin frame swallowed by the oversized t-shirt Danny had found for her. Her eyes locked on the fragment, her breathing quick and shallow. Corey hovered behind her, his arms wrapped around himself like the night air was pressing too hard against his skin. He's here, Kiana said again, voice thin as thread. There's no one outside, Danny replied, stepping off the porch to scan the yard once more, his flashlight slicing the fog into useless ribbons. His breath misted in the cool air, the world too silent for comfort. There were no cicadas, no distant hum of passing trucks, not even the rustle of wind through the dry leaves. But the porch creaked again, slow, measured, as if something heavy was shifting just beyond sight. Danny turned back to the twins. Inside. Now. They didn't argue. Kiana grabbed Corey's hand and pulled him back into the house, both moving fast, practiced, like they'd been running from ghosts their whole lives. Danny followed, locking the door behind him. The deadbolt scraped loud in the hush. He set the wooden fragment on the kitchen counter, fingers twitching with the need to do something, to chase, to fight. But there was nothing to aim at, just the empty night and the weight of the word carved into rotting wood. You need to tell me what's going on, Danny said, his voice quieter than he meant. What does that house have to do with Royce? Kiana's fingers curled into the hem of her borrowed shirt. Her feet shifted, weight rocking from one heel to the other, like she was considering running even now. Corey climbed onto the worn couch, pulling his knees up, curling small as a hedgehog. He's not just a man, Kiana whispered. Danny's brow furrowed. What do you mean? She licked her lips, her gaze darting to the front door like she expected it to fly open at any second. He owns the house, she said, not like papers and stuff. He owns it. It listens to him. That's not possible, Danny said, but the wood on the counter was still warm, and there was nothing logical about that either. It's been his since before we lived there, Corey added, voice muffled against his knees. Since before we were even born. Kiana's mouth tightened, her jaw trembling with the effort to keep secrets locked behind her teeth. But Danny waited, saying nothing, letting the silence press until her need to fill it overcame her fear. The first night we moved in, she said finally, her voice so quiet it barely existed. He told us the house had rules. Rules we had to follow. No locked doors. No lights after midnight. And never, never, try to leave after dark. Danny's skin prickled. What happens if you break the rules? He knows, Corey whispered. Even if he's not there, he knows. We didn't believe him at first, Kiana said. But the house told him. The house told him, Danny repeated, the words tasting ridiculous in his mouth. How? Kiana's gaze met his, dark and exhausted, too old for her face. It shows him, she said, like it remembers. The first time they tried to leave, Kiana had been 6. She remembered it the way you remember a nightmare you swear was real. Too clear, too sharp, every detail burned into her like a scar. Her mom had been passed out in the bedroom, an empty wine bottle on the floor beside her hand. Royce had been gone for days, some job in another town. And the silence in the house had started to feel alive, like a breath waiting to be exhaled. She grabbed Corey's hand and crept down the stairs, every creak under her feet feeling like a scream. They'd made it to the front door, hand on the knob, when the whole house seemed to shudder, like the wood itself was holding its breath. And then the lights flickered. And not the way lights do when there's a storm. They blinked in patterns, long, short, short, long, like some broken code. Every window locked itself with a snap. The front door refused to turn, no matter how hard they pulled. They hadn't even made it back to bed when Royce came home, calm and smiling like he already knew, like the house had whispered it straight into his ear. After that, they never tried again. Danny rubbed his face, exhaustion and disbelief colliding in his skull. It was impossible. The house didn't have a mind. It didn't watch. Except something had left that piece of wood on his porch. Something had carved hone into it with the steady hand of someone sending a message, not to the twins, but to Danny. Royce didn't just find us, Kiana said softly. The house sent him. All right, Danny said, standing slowly. Here's what we're going to do. First, you're staying here tonight. Tomorrow, we're gonna figure out where we go from there. Kiana didn't look convinced. You don't get it. It's not just the house. It's him. He doesn't care where we run. Why? Danny asked. What does he want from you? Her arms wrapped tighter around herself. We're his. No, Danny said, sharper than he meant. You're not. You don't understand, she said, voice cracking. We're not just kids to him. We're part of the house now. As long as we're alive, it's his. Danny's stomach twisted. That's not how it works. It is for him. The second noise came at 3:23 a.m. This time, it wasn't the porch. It was the basement door. Danny didn't remember leaving the basement door unlocked. It was always shut, always stiff enough that you had to put your shoulder into it. But now it hung open, black mouth yawning into the hallway. The smell of wet earth rising like a breath. Kiana stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale in the glow from the hall light. He's here, she said again, softer now, like she wasn't warning, just stating fact. Danny raised his gun, stepping forward, peering down the stairs. Nothing moved, just damp concrete and the flicker of the old pull chain light swinging slightly, like something had just brushed past it. He descended slowly, each step careful, gun at the ready. His own breath sounded too loud in the silence. The basement was empty. Dusty shelves, unused paint cans, an old washer and dryer humming faintly. Nothing else. Except, in the center of the floor, the concrete was cracked. A long, jagged line running from wall to wall, like a scar the house itself couldn't hide. The dirt beneath it was fresh. Danny knelt, fingertips brushing the crack. It was cold, not cool like a basement should be, but cold like something had been lying beneath the floor, waiting. And then, just faint enough that he thought maybe it was his imagination. He felt it. A heartbeat. Beneath the floor. He stumbled back, nearly dropping the gun. His own heart pounded so loud it nearly drowned out the echo beneath his feet. The house remembered. And somewhere, Royce was listening. He bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut, throwing the deadbolt. Kiana stood in the hallway, Corey at her side, both wide-eyed and waiting. We're leaving, Danny said, voice hoarse. Now. Where? Kiana asked. Somewhere that house can't follow. Kiana's face was pale. There's nowhere. Danny knelt in front of her, hands firm on her shoulders. There's me. She swallowed hard, like she wanted to believe him. Behind her, the basement door creaked. Once, then twice. A house was listening. Beneath the floors, the house was awake. Danny didn't believe in hauntings, not officially. On paper, he was a practical man, a cop who dealt in evidence, facts, and things he could put in a report. But standing there with the basement door trembling slightly on its hinges, a cold draft curling out from beneath the threshold, there was no explaining this with paperwork. No checklist covered houses that remembered who belonged to them, or those who tried to leave. Kiana's hand was ice cold when it latched onto his wrist. It's awake, she whispered. It knows we're not there. The twins' small, wide-eyed faces reminded him of flood evacuees from years back, kids who had to be carried out of drowned homes clutching stuffed animals, still waiting for someone to tell them the storm was over. But the storm wasn't over for Kiana and Corey. It had followed them. Grab your shoes, Danny said. Both of you, we're going. Where? Kiana's voice was thin, high, too calm for the fear in her eyes. Somewhere Royce can't follow, Danny said. Kiana didn't argue, but her silence was heavy with doubt. She didn't believe such a place existed, and neither did part of Danny. His own house wasn't safe anymore. The house on Ridgeway, Royce's house, had reached out, and now it had found them. As they hurried into the night, Corey clutching his shoes in one hand and Kiana holding his other, Danny locked the front door even though the lock felt meaningless. The house hadn't needed an open door to reach them. A house remembered. The patrol car cut through the heavy southern night, headlights slicing the fog. Kiana and Corey sat curled in the back seat, wrapped in the old fleece blanket Danny kept behind the seat, their silhouettes half visible in the rearview mirror. Their eyes never left the windows, scanning the dark streets like they expected to see Royce's battered black pickup sliding out of the mist at any moment. The radio crackled softly with dispatch chatter, but Danny barely heard it. His fingers drummed the wheel, his mind racing. There was nowhere safe in town. Nowhere Royce didn't know. Police stations, shelters, even the group homes. Royce had tendrils in all of them. He was the kind of man who made friends in all the wrong places, who could make a phone call from any payphone or borrowed cell and know exactly where his kids were within an hour. But it wasn't just Royce anymore. It was the house. Every streetlight they passed flickered slightly, just enough for Danny to notice. At first, he thought it was nothing. Then he saw the pattern. 2 flickers, pause, 1 flicker, pause. It was the same rhythm Kiana had described when they tried to run before. Long, short, short, long. A pulse. The house's pulse. Why does the house want you back? Danny asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Kiana's hands twisted the blanket into knots. Because it's part of him, she said softly. Part of Royce. She shook her head, her eyes locked on the window, fog curling outside like fingers trying to pry their way in. Part of something older. They drove east, past the county line, toward the old Pinebrook water treatment plant, a place the locals avoided after dark. It was where Danny took scared kids once before, kids running from something, needing just one night off the grid. No cameras, no lights, just an empty concrete shell where the river used to flow in. It would buy them time, but not much. When they reached the rusting gate, Danny killed the headlights and eased through. Gravel crunched under the tires, loud in the stillness. The plant stood like a corpse in the moonlight, all sharp angles and broken windows, vines curling up the sides like the earth itself was trying to pull it under. Here, Kiana whispered. Just for tonight, Danny said. He won't look here. That was half true. Royce might not. But the house? Danny wasn't so sure. They made camp in the main processing hall, a massive open space where rusted pipes arched overhead like ribs, and the cracked concrete floor was littered with old leaves and broken glass. Danny laid out his jacket for Kiana and Corey, his gun resting on his knee, eyes flicking constantly toward the shattered windows. "Tell me about the house," he said quietly. "All of it." Kiana stared at her hands. "It's not our house," she said. "It was Royce's before we ever lived there. He told us once. He didn't buy it. He found it. Found it. In the woods," she said. "It was just there, even though it's on a regular street now. But it wasn't always." Danny's gut twisted. "What do you mean?" Kiana's gaze flicked up, dark and heavy. "The house moves. The first family lived there in 1919. That was what Kiana overheard one night when Royce was drunk, muttering to himself on the back porch. The house had been somewhere else back then, on the edge of town, closer to the water. That family disappeared. Completely. No bodies. No trace. The house sat empty for years, and then it appeared again. But not in the same spot. It was on a different street. No record of being moved. No foundation repairs. It was just there, like it had always been. Another family moved in. They vanished too. Over the years, the house shifted. Every few decades, it appeared somewhere new, a slightly different shape, but always the same bones underneath. And always, there was someone like Royce, someone it chose to belong to, someone who knew its rules. And once the house chose you, you were never free. "Royce doesn't own the house," Kiana whispered. "The house owns him." Danny's mouth was dry. "And now it wants you back." She nodded. "It remembers us. And it doesn't like when things it remembers leave." The first noise came at 3:08 a.m. It was faint, just a scrape against the concrete floor, somewhere far back in the dark processing plant. A noise too deliberate to be an animal, too soft to be the wind. Kiana's breath caught. Danny stood, gun drawn, stepping between the twins and the darkness. His flashlight beam cut through the dust-filled air, illuminating only broken pipes and rusted catwalks. But the scrape came again, closer this time. Danny's heart pounded. "Stay here," he whispered to the twins. "No," Kiana said. "Don't." But Danny stepped forward, light sweeping the ground. His boots crunched on glass and dirt, echoing off the high ceiling. The scrape came again, right ahead. The beam caught something at his feet. Another piece of wood, old, splintered, weathered. This one said, "Well siua mi haon." And as the words burned into his mind, the pipes above him groaned, metal twisting, old rust flaking away like scabs. The air itself seemed to shift, warmer, closer, like breath against his neck. When he turned around, the processing plant was gone. The walls, the windows, all of it. He stood in a hallway. The wallpaper was damp, peeling in strips, and the floorboards creaked beneath his feet. The air smelled like rot and rainwater and something older. He knew where he was. He was inside Royce's house, and from the far end of the hall, a single, low voice whispered, "Come back inside, officer. Back in the real world. The outside world." Kiana screamed. The room was empty. Officer Danny Corbin was gone. Only the twins remained, and the house remembered them both. The house that ate the sky. Danny Corbin knew the feel of his own heartbeat, a steady, reliable thump that carried him through foot chases, tense arrests, and the quiet moments of doubt that came when his son's bedroom stood empty after every weekend visit. But the heartbeat he felt now wasn't his own. It was beneath his feet, in the walls, in the air itself. A slow, wet pulse, like something breathing through broken ribs. The hallway stretched too long in front of him. It was never this long in the house on Ridgeway. The real house, the one on paper, was a 2-story colonial with warped floors and smoke-stained wallpaper. But this hallway felt like it had grown from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, folding in on itself like intestines. Each step he took, the floorboards rippled underfoot, not solid wood but something softer, something alive. Danny, a voice whispered. Not Royce. Something older, its words sliding through the walls like damp fingers tracing the wood. You should have left them. Danny didn't answer. His training wanted him to treat this like a hostage rescue. Controlled breathing, clear corners, always think 3 steps ahead. But there was no ahead. The house made the rules. He passed a door on his left. It was cracked open just enough to see a sliver of inside. A child's room. The walls papered in cartoon dinosaurs. The bed made up with a blue quilt. It was a room that belonged to no one. A memory, maybe, stitched together from the house's long and terrible history. The walls sighed. The wallpaper near his shoulder peeled away, curling at the edges like it wanted to whisper something. Beneath the paper, the plaster was wet, not with water, but something thicker, something that smelled faintly metallic. Blood. The house was bleeding. Outside the house, the world shifts. Kiana stood in the empty processing plant, her hands shaking so hard her nails dug into her palms, half-moon marks welling red. Danny had vanished, not walked away, not dragged, just gone, like the house had reached through a crack in the air and pulled him sideways. Where did he go? Corey's voice was too loud in the empty hall, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Where did he go, Kiana? I don't know, she whispered. But she did. The house had found him. It could reach through thin places, places where the air was soft, like old skin. If it wanted you bad enough, it could pull. We can't stay here, Kiana said, grabbing Corey's wrist. But what about Officer Danny? Corey's voice cracked. We can't leave him. Kiana's stomach twisted. Danny was the first adult who hadn't looked away, hadn't flinched when he saw the bruises. He was good, the kind of good that always got swallowed first. We can't help him if the house gets us too, she said, her voice shaking. We have to find it. The first place. What first place? The place where it started. Corey didn't argue. He never argued with her when her voice sounded like this. The voice she used when Royce was in the house, and every breath felt like stepping on glass. Together, they ran. Danny inside the house. There was no clock here. No time. Just rooms that weren't rooms, spaces stitched from memories the house had devoured. 1 minute Danny was in a hallway. The next he stepped through a door and found himself in a kitchen. The kitchen wasn't his. It wasn't Royce's either. It was too old, the appliances olive green, the countertops cracked formica, the wallpaper a cheerful floral pattern long yellowed with age. Plates sat untouched on the table, thick with dust. A child's cup, plastic covered in faded butterflies, sat next to a plate of uneaten eggs, perfectly preserved. On the far wall, a family portrait hung crooked. Danny stepped closer. The faces had no eyes, just blank, pale skin stretched smooth where their eyes should have been. The mouths were stitched shut with fine black thread, as if they'd all tried to scream at once, and the house had silenced them. You shouldn't be here, a voice said behind him. Danny spun, gun raised. A man stood in the doorway. Not Royce. Someone older. The man's skin was like paper, thin, almost translucent, stretched too tight over bones that seemed one size too big. His eyes were pale, almost white, and his smile was too wide. The skin at the corners split and raw. This is my house, the man said. Who the hell are you? Danny demanded. The man tilted his head. That depends. What year is it? The first owner. His name was Edwin Mallard, Royce's grandfather. In 1919, he found the house. Not built, found. In a clearing deep in the woods outside Pinebrook. It wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. The house didn't need repairs. It didn't need furniture. It had all of that already, as if it had been expecting someone to move in. Edwin brought his new bride to live there, and for a time, things were normal. Except the house kept changing. Sometimes doors appeared where there weren't doors before. Sometimes entire rooms shifted position overnight. Edwin tried to leave once. He made it 5 miles before the road looped. And suddenly, he was back at the front porch, the house's windows reflecting the sky like hungry eyes. The house didn't let you leave unless it wanted you to. It didn't want Edwin to leave. So he stayed. He grew old inside the house, even when his wife disappeared, even when the house whispered to him secrets it had learned from the bones beneath its foundation. By the time Edwin died, the house no longer wanted. It needed someone to belong to. That's where Royce came in. "You're Royce's family," Danny said, breath sharp. "Royce belongs to the house," the old man said, "the same way I did." "Where is he?" The man smiled, the stitches at the corner of his mouth pulling wide. "He's inside. Deeper than you." Danny's gun trembled in his grip. "How do I get out?" "You don't," the man said. "The house remembers you now." Kiana and Corey find the beginning. They stood at the edge of the old clearing. Nothing grew there. No grass, no weeds, just a circle of bare dirt where the house had first been. Kiana could still see it, not with her eyes, but with her memory. It had been smaller back then, more like a cabin, with wood that looked like it had been pulled from the earth itself, dark and damp and waiting. The house had moved since then, to Ridgeway, to other streets, always slipping just beneath notice, shifting to fit new owners. But the land never forgot. "We have to wake it up," Kiana said. Corey's eyes widened. "Why would we do that?" "Because it's distracted," she said. "It's looking for us. But if we call it back to where it started, maybe it'll open." "Open what?" "The door. Inside the house. The door opens." The old man vanished, leaving Danny alone in the shifting kitchen. The air vibrated like a struck wire, and the floor peeled back, not wood, not tile, but skin stretched taut over dark earth. A doorway yawned in the floor, leading down into something blacker than the house itself. A root cellar. But when Danny aimed his flashlight down, the light couldn't reach the bottom. Because there was no bottom. There was only falling. And somewhere, deep below, Royce was waiting. Danny took a breath and stepped inside. The house swallowed him whole. Where the roots end. The descent. There was no floor. There was no staircase. There was only the sensation of falling. Danny Corbin felt the weightlessness pull him down, his stomach lurching into his throat, but his body didn't slam into anything solid. The flashlight in his hand flickered, sputtered, and died. There was no up, no down, no sense of gravity at all. Just the house, swallowing him into something older than basements, older than Pine Brook itself. The walls were made of wood that breathed. The air had the texture of warm breath on the back of his neck. His boots squelched into dirt that shifted like skin under pressure. And somewhere below, or above, or all around him, a sound like roots tearing open echoed through the darkness. He wasn't in the house anymore. He was beneath it. Somewhere older than floors and doors. The twins light a fire. Kiana and Corey stood at the edge of the clearing. The original spot where the house had first appeared, back before roads had names and the land was still wild enough to hide monsters. There was no house here now. But the earth remembered. The ground pulsed beneath their feet, faint and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a buried animal waiting for its leash to snap. Kiana dropped to her knees, digging her fingers into the dirt, clawing away at the thin layer of leaves and mud until she felt it. The foundation stone. It was smooth, too smooth for something left in the ground this long. It wasn't granite or brick. It felt like bone. "What are you doing?" Corey's voice shook, his breath coming fast, white in the cold air. Kiana didn't look up. "We have to call it back." "But why?" "Because it's reaching too far," she whispered. "The house is supposed to hold it, but now it's spreading." Corey didn't understand, not fully, but he knew enough to follow his sister's lead. Together, they scraped at the earth until the stone was fully uncovered. A perfect rectangle, just large enough for the two of them to stand on. "Hold my hand," Kiana said. Corey's fingers found hers, small and cold and trembling. She closed her eyes. And then, softly at first, she began to hum. The house remembers everything. Danny landed, if you could call it that, on something that felt like damp roots wrapped in cloth. It wasn't solid ground, and the longer he stood, the more he felt the surface shift under him, adjusting to his weight like a living thing. The darkness was complete. His breath fogged the air in front of him, but he couldn't see it. Danny. The voice was Royce's, but it came from everywhere. A single match struck in the dark. The tiny bloom of flame revealed Royce Mallard standing a few feet away, his skin pale as wax, his eyes black and sunken like holes punched into his face. His smile was too wide, stretched at the corners, the skin raw and split like someone had hooked their fingers into his mouth and pulled. "Welcome home," Royce said. Danny raised his gun. "Where are the kids?" "They're free for now," Royce said, his voice syrupy smooth. "But you belong to the house now." "I don't belong to anything." "Oh, but you do," Royce chuckled. "The house only lets you in if it remembers you. And now, it remembers you." The match went out, and all around Danny, the walls began to whisper. They weren't words. They were pieces of words, fragments of every scream, every prayer, every whispered apology that had ever passed through the house's walls. Some were from children. Some were from wives. Some were from men who thought they were the masters of the house, until they learned otherwise. The house didn't belong to Royce. Royce belonged to the thing beneath the house, the thing that had grown beneath its shifting floors, feeding on every fear, every death, every desperate plea to be let go. It was alive, and it was hungry. The ritual. In the clearing, Kiana's humming grew louder. The air thickened, the sky itself seeming to press lower, closer, until the stars flickered like candle flames about to go out. The ground beneath the twins trembled, a faint vibration that climbed up their legs, into their chests, until it felt like their hearts were beating with the earth. "Are you sure this will work?" Corey whispered. "No, but you're doing it anyway." Kiana's hand squeezed his, "Because someone has to." The ground cracked, and the house, the original house, the first virgin, began to rise from the earth like a rotten tooth being pulled from black gums. Royce's bargain. "You're not the first cop to come here," Royce said, circling Danny. His feet didn't make a sound on the ground, as if the house itself carried him. "The house loves men like you. Men who think saving one kid can fix everything." "It's not about fixing everything," Danny said through clenched teeth. "It's about saving who I can." Royce stopped, head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Then save yourself." The ground split open beneath Danny's feet, and from that crack, something reached. It wasn't a hand. It wasn't anything human. It was roots, long, blackened things slick with ancient rot, curling like fingers around his ankles, his calves, pulling him down. Danny fired. The bullet hit nothing. The roots didn't bleed. The house shuddered. The twins break the chain. The house in the clearing rose fully now, not a real house, but a memory of one, its walls translucent, flickering between solid and shadow. The windows were black eyes, the front door a mouth yawning wide. Kiana stood on the foundation stone, her voice rising now. Not humming, but chanting words she didn't understand. Words that had come to her the first time Royce locked them in the basement, and the house whispered back. "Bring it back," she said. "Bring it all back." The house obeyed. Every version of the house. Every place it had stood. Every family it had swallowed. Manifested, layer after layer stacking on top of each other, until the house was too big, too twisted, too full of memories to hold itself together. It began to collapse inward, into itself, pulling the roots back into the earth. Danny's last chance. The roots around Danny's legs loosened. The air above him ripped open, and for the briefest second, he saw the clearing. saw the twins standing on the foundation stone, the house crumbling into the dirt behind them. Royce screamed. Danny grabbed the opening with both hands, and he climbed. The house tried to pull him back, walls shifting, floors tilting, voices begging him to stay. But Danny climbed, fingers bleeding, lungs burning, until the ground swallowed the last of the house and spat him out into the dirt beside Kiana and Corey. The clearing was silent. The house was gone. Epilogue. Ridgeway Street. 1 year later, Ridgeway Street was just a street again. The lot where the house once stood was empty, the grass still refusing to grow, but no one talked about it anymore. People remembered something standing there, but no one remembered who lived there. Memory was soft like that. Kiana and Corey were living with a foster family across the county line. Good people, the kind with patience and soft voices. Danny checked in when he could. He was no longer a cop. Some fights you don't walk away from clean. But every so often, he'd find himself driving back down Ridgeway, just to see, just to make sure. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the air was still and the night was too quiet, he could swear he heard the faintest hum beneath the ground. The house was gone. But the roots, they were always there, waiting.